Morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China on the dismantling of Hong Kong civil society will come to order. Earlier this month, Hong Kong marked the 25th anniversary of the British handover to the People's Republic of China. Instead of celebrating the high degree of autonomy and universal suffrage promised to the people of Hong Kong, this anniversary serves as an occasion for Chinese leader Xi Jinping to go to Hong Kong and flaunt the control he now wields over the city. It has now been 2 years since implementation of Hong Kong's draconian national security law. In these 2 years, authorities...
Corona.
In these 2 years, authorities completed the transformation of Hong Kong from an open society into a city gripped by fear of the mainland's authoritarian repression. A city that once boasted a vibrant civil society and pro-democratic institutions saw these pillars of what made Hong Kong so special systematically dismantled. The Hong Kong government now jails protesters and politicians, shuts down independent media, and silences critics, even criminalizing dissent. At least 10,500 Hong Kongers have been arrested for political and protest-related offenses. No fewer than 123 individuals face national security charges and will likely be tried with few or no due process protections and with possible extradition to mainland China. At least 65 civil society organizations have shut down or left Hong Kong for fear of prosecution under the national security law. Today, sadly, that once vibrant civil society is crushed, muted, and scattered. Today's hearing offers a microcosm of what's happened and what remains. Our witnesses bring a deep history in civil society in Hong Kong, as well as experience being persecuted and having to continue their work in exile in Tokyo, in London, in Los Angeles, and here in Washington, D.C. Like so many, they continue to fight for the people of Hong Kong and its once proud institutions. In recent months, this commission has heard from dozens of Hong Kong's true patriots, journalists, human rights advocates, students, former legislators, social workers, and religious clergy, non-governmental organization staff, doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers, and trade union organizers. In the coming days, we will release a report on what those members of civil society have experienced, largely in their own words. And today's hearing offers a glimpse into that bleak picture. The Chinese government's policy of crushing resistance turns Hong Kong into a city subject to centralized political control like other cities in China. The civil society voices we've heard from view authorities as co-opting those who can be bought, constraining those who can be intimidated, and cracking down on those who cannot be silenced. As we hear some of those stories today, I look forward to learning from our witnesses what we can do to support the civil society that remains in Hong Kong and organizations that now operate elsewhere on behalf of the people of Hong Kong. I look forward to exploring with the Biden administration the additional steps that can be taken to hold accountable those responsible for undermining Hong Kong's autonomy, basic rights, and rule of law. Later today, the Commission will release a report, a staff analysis on the role of Hong Kong's prosecutors in these abuses. We hope that this analysis, like the work we do documenting political prisoner cases generally, will shine a light in a dark place and point to a better path ahead. Without objection, these supplementary materials will be entered into the record. I now recognize Congressman McGovern for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on the erosion of civil society in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has long been a particular interest of this commission. From the start, 20 years ago, our annual report has included a discrete Hong Kong chapter. This is the 6th hearing on Hong Kong or featuring a witness on Hong Kong in my 3.5 years as House co-chair. The reason for this heightened attention is regrettable, however. The changes in this time have been dramatic. 3 years ago this summer, the world witnessed massive protests in the streets of Hong Kong. The trigger was an extradition treaty that put residents at risk of being forcibly sent to the mainland. The context was the steady erosion of democratic norms under Chinese government and Communist Party influence. For our September 2019 hearing on the protests, witnesses flew in from Hong Kong. They would not be able to do that today. One witness was Joshua Wong, a leader of the pro-democracy movement, making his second appearance before the CECC. Today, he is in prison on political charges. Another was Denise Ho, a democracy activist and singer. She was arrested and released on bail and still faces charges of the crime of supporting democracy. In 2020, the central government passed the National Security Law, providing a quote-unquote legal basis for political persecutions of those deemed oppositional to the party's priorities. Further, Hong Kong authorities have imposed measures aligned with the ideological priorities of the central government. These include removing books from libraries, pushing patriotic education in schools, revising history to suit party narratives, and suppressing LGBTQ voices. These impulses are not exclusive to Hong Kong or China. We see such evidence of authoritarian creep in many places at home and abroad. Today, we hear from citizens and residents of Hong Kong who have been firsthand witnesses to this extraordinary change. The fact that none of our witnesses remain in Hong Kong is indicative of the crackdown. We invite them to share their stories and to speak for their friends and colleagues still in Hong Kong who are not able to speak for themselves. We not only want to hear the state of civil society, but to receive recommendations, as the chairman said, on what U.S. policymakers can do to support those who still desire democracy and human rights. I also welcome your recommendations on whether the U.S. should create humanitarian pathways for those fleeing repression in Hong Kong. And lastly, let us not forget the prisoners of conscience who are in jail or on trial in Hong Kong. Joshua Wong, Jimmy Lai, Sid Ho, Claudia Mo, and so many others. We continue to stand with them and to advocate for their release. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know the staff are working on analytical products in conjunction to this hearing, and I look forward to the publication as you held up this report, and I look forward to the testimony today. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern. Congressman Smith, do you wish to make any opening comments?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this very important hearing on the very disturbing dismantling of civil society in Hong Kong that we see taking place right before our very eyes. Last October, I had convened a hearing at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which I co-chair with my good friend and colleague, Jim McGovern, on the state of civil and political rights in Hong Kong. What we heard then with regard to the erosion of civil and political rights was deeply concerning. But as much as the danger signs were all flashing red some 9 months ago, the situation has only gotten worse since then, as we shall hear from our witnesses. And while this deterioration has impacted civil society organizations across the board, I want to focus on one aspect of civil society that until very recently has been very vibrant, namely the faith-based sector and parochial education provided principally by Catholic schools. Indeed, though estimated as constituting only 5% of the overall population, the Catholic imprint on Hong Kong's elites has been quite profound. One thanks to the great democracy advocate and lawyer, Martin Lee, whose faith motivated his commitment to democracy and the rule of law, Albert Ho, former chairman of the Democratic Party, and Anson Chan, the former chief executive who pushed for direct democracy for Hong Kong. Or Jimmy Lai, the billionaire who founded the Giordano Clothing and Retail Emporium, as well as founded and financed the fiercely independent Apple Daily, which was shut down by the government in June of last year. Jimmy, a convert to Catholicism, was arrested and charged with crimes under the draconian national security law, which was enacted in 2020 at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. Jimmy remains in jail, but he is a man of faith who easily could have fled to safety, like the roughly 90,000 citizens who left Hong Kong between June 2020 and June 2021 because he is or was a rich man. Yet Jimmy stayed in Hong Kong to stand with those who spoke for freedom. Such a heroic man. Towering above all is Cardinal Zen, who for years has been warning about Communist China's efforts to control the church, in particular its Catholic schools, as well as education in general. The church resisted efforts in 2012 to impose propagandistic citizen education using mainland-approved textbooks in Catholic schools, which was a mere 10 years ago. Fast forward today, however, and the teachers are being purged from schools at all different levels in Hong Kong, not only Catholic ones. The Cardinal has been a thorn in the side of Beijing, as well as those in Hong Kong who sought to do the Chinese Communist Party's bidding. Thus, one perhaps should not be surprised that at the beginning of this year, a series of 4 articles appeared in Tai Kong Po, a newspaper owned by the Chinese government via its liaison office in Hong Kong, attacking the Cardinal. They ominously likened him to practitioners of Falun Gong, whose adherents are horribly persecuted in mainland China, while also calling for greater curtailment of religious liberty. Then, at 90 years of age, the next shoe dropped. The Cardinal was arrested in May of this year and charged under the national security law. His offenses included subversion, in other words, supporting democracy protesters, and collusion with foreign organizations. The latter is especially chilling when one considers how in communist China, the Catholic Church was deemed a foreign power, with Chinese Catholics on the mainland forced to either join a patriotic church or go underground. Yet these heroic individuals aren't the only prominent Catholics in Hong Kong. Both former Chief Executive Carrie Lam and current Executive John Lee, who previously served as Secretary of Security, identify as Catholics and went to Catholic schools. These are the 2 individuals most closely associated with implementing Beijing's policy mandates and enforcing the national security law, leading to the dismantling of Hong Kong's civil society. Indeed, just the other day, the Holy See's envoy and unofficial representative in Hong Kong, Monsignor Javier Herrera Corona, warned that the Hong Kong Catholics, their freedoms they had enjoyed in the past are now fast disappearing, and cautioned missionaries that Hong Kong is, quote, not the great Catholic beachhead it was. While it's so frustrating about this, and what is so frustrating, is all the signals that were missed here in Washington, indeed here in Congress as well, leading up to this. I first introduced the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act in 2014 during the 213 Congress. It was the time of the Umbrella Movement, which began in response to a decision by the Standing Committee of the PRC's National People's Congress to pre-screen candidates for Hong Kong's chief executive position, effectively excluding those Beijing deemed unreliable. A new generation of democracy leaders, as we all know, emerged, including great students and leaders like Joshua Wong and Nathan Law. International observers and the foreign media cheered these advocates, as did we, and there was a sense of optimism and enthusiasm. Perhaps because of that optimism at the time, it was hard to get our congressional colleagues to see clearly the gathering threat to Hong Kong democracy and civil and political rights. Our bill had only 5 co-sponsors that year, including now Speaker Nancy Pelosi. As I have noted in the past, many believed in Hong Kong, with its greater freedom and free trade principles, could help turn and tug the People's Republic of China in a liberalizing fashion. Hong Kong's basic law was a mini constitution that some believed could serve as a model for expanding respect for the rule of law in China one day. Such hope sadly proved illusionary. In March of 2019, the Hong Kong government proposed extraditing alleged criminals to China, raising fears that political dissidents could be sent to mainland China to face charges over exercising basic freedoms. Hong Kong's government, using an increasingly aggressive police force, began to resemble that of mainland China in responding to legitimate protest, speech, and peaceable assembly. Congress too awakened to the changed situation, and with now 47 co-sponsors, and under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, our Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act passed the House with Lantos Commission co-chair Jim McGovern, I'm happy to say, as the lead Democrat. Indeed, that same day, Jim's bill placing restrictions on tear gas exports and crowd control technology to Hong Kong also passed with me as the lead Republican co-sponsor. When the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was enacted into law, the Trump administration declared that Hong Kong was no longer, quote, sufficiently autonomous, such as to warrant being treated as independent of China for trade and technology export purposes, and further sanctioned key individuals in the Hong Kong government, including Carrie Lam. While we can point to this as a victory, with Republicans and Democrats united, frankly speaking, we all know it was the case of too little and too late. Certainly too late to help save democracy and civil society in Hong Kong. Thus, here we are, no longer at a crossroads, but further down the wrong road. Where we go from here depends in part on whether the world is paying attention, and especially whether we here are paying attention, which is why this hearing today is so important. To Martin Lee, Howard Ho, Cardinal Zen, Jimmy Lai, Joshua Wong, and all of those who have been unjustly arrested or imprisoned, please know you are not forgotten. With that, I look forward to the hearing from our very distinguished witnesses. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I'd now like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Patrick Poon is a visiting researcher at the Institute for Comparative Law at the Meiji University in Tokyo. He is advisor to the 29 Principles, a United Kingdom-based organization supporting lawyers facing oppression. In his years in Hong Kong, he served as a court reporter for the South China Morning Post, China Labor Bulletin, the China Human Rights Lawyers Concern Group, the Independent Chinese Penn Center, and Amnesty International. Fermi Wong is founder and former executive director of Hong Kong Unison, a group that promotes equality for ethnic minorities. Her work running a civil society organization in Hong Kong has been featured in Time Magazine, the South China Morning Post magazine, Hong Kong Free Press. Now in the United Kingdom, she seeks to promote Hong Kong civil society abroad. Ching Cheong is a veteran journalist who worked for the state-owned Wenwei Po newspaper for 15 years, acquiring knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party's interference in Hong Kong affairs. He is featured in a recent Economist article titled, "How a Free and Open Hong Kong Became a Police State." Before he left Hong Kong, he was involved with independent media and journalist organizations. He joins us from Los Angeles this morning. Samuel Bickett is a human rights lawyer focused on the rule of law and civil liberties in Hong Kong and a fellow at the Georgetown Center for Asian Law. He was a corporate sanctions and corruption lawyer based in Hong Kong from 2013 to 2021. He was arrested during the 2019 protests and convicted, imprisoned twice, and then deported from Hong Kong earlier this year. Thank you all for joining us to bring your stories, your knowledge, and your expertise, and we look forward to your testimony. And we will begin with Patrick Poon, who is joining us from Tokyo.
I'd like to thank the CECC and the distinguished audience for giving me this opportunity to share my experience and my view on the situation of the civil society in Hong Kong. I focus on the drastic change of civil society space from the time I changed my job as a journalist to become an NGO worker with local and international NGOs since the early 2000s to the era of RedNet, as I would describe, after the national security law was imposed on Hong Kong by the Chinese authorities. Red line is simply not enough to describe the scope. The Hong Kong and Chinese governments wouldn't even make it clear about where the red line is so that they can arbitrarily restrict Hong Kong people's freedoms. The message is clear. You can only survive if you don't challenge the government. When I started my NGO career, focusing on supporting workers, writers, and lawyers in mainland China, the civil society was very vibrant. We could organize all kinds of activities, ranging from staging demonstrations to call for release of detained dissidents in China, to arranging writers and lawyers to meet with their counterparts in Hong Kong. We never experienced any interference or felt any threats. Even when I was an Amnesty researcher, I wouldn't feel too much for my personal risk when I come into the on the detention of Chinese dissidents, or when I work on documenting Uyghur and Kazakh cases in relation to political re-education camps. I still remember how a mainland Chinese writer once exclaimed when he arrived in Hong Kong, and I met him at the train station. He said, "I could finally breathe the air of freedom." It was a time when many young university graduates in Hong Kong who would be willing to get a relatively low salary to work on issues that we believe we could do something to help our friends in China. During that time, I was able to communicate with many high-profile mainland Chinese dissidents without fear. Late Nobel Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo had so much hope for Hong Kong's support that he contacted me and several others in Hong Kong in late 2008 to invite prominent pro-democracy figures in Hong Kong to co-sign the Charter 08. Many of those democratic figures, some of them now in prison, and myself were among the first batch of co-signatories. We didn't need to think much when we decided to co-sign it. These experiences led me to continue my work in international NGOs like Amnesty, as I believe that it is significant to push China to comply with its international obligations. It's unimaginable at the time that Hong Kong freedom of expression and freedom of assembly are completely gone. Even prayer meetings or mass to commemorate the victims of the Tiananmen massacre are now deemed too sensitive. For NGOs in Hong Kong, we used to feel secure to organize talks on Hong Kong issues in China and Hong Kong, no matter public or closed door, with universities in Hong Kong. We didn't need to worry too much about our personal safety comparing with activists in mainland China. But now everyone needs to have a second thought or self-censor the content of the events before planning such activities. We used to be able to organize public talks by inviting human rights lawyers from China to share their experiences to the general public. Now it's just imaginable how similar activities could be done anymore in Hong Kong. We used to be able to hold public rallies from small scales of demonstrations outside China's central government liaison office, calling for the release of detained Chinese citizens, to mass rallies calling for universal suffrage in Hong Kong without any interference. Police officers at that time were friendly and would even engage in discussing the route with the organizers. The police made it very clear to us that we didn't need to get the permission to hold any rallies. We only needed to inform them, and they would routinely issue a letter of no objection, only formalities, despite the public order ordinance has to be repeatedly criticized by the UN human rights experts as restrictive of freedom of assembly. Sometimes the police would even call us to confirm that we would be organizing a demonstration if we forgot to inform them in advance. However, after the anti-extradition bill protest in 2019 and the imposition of the NSL in 2020, the situation has completely changed. Anybody appearing in places like the Victoria Park or where the annual candlelight vigil to commemorate the Tiananmen massacre used to take place on June 4th would be questioned by the police and warned that they would be charged with illegal assembly if they stayed there. Like many Hong Kongers, I honestly didn't believe that Unionist Lee Cheuk-yan, solicitor and former legislator Albert Ho, and barrister Chow Han-tung, leaders of a now disbanded Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China, which organized the candlelight vigil, would be accused of inciting an unauthorized assembly for an assembly that had been allowed for 30 years. They are now even facing the same notorious charge of inciting subversion of state power, like many Chinese activists. Finally, I would also like to share a bit about my experience as a former court reporter, as I'm puzzled how difficult it is to cover court news in Hong Kong nowadays. I cover quite a lot of trials about protesters being accused of obstruction in public place for staging small-scale protests that occupy some space, such as outside China's central government liaison office. Those were already the big news in those days. The sentences the protesters faced at that time were only about a few weeks. Granting bail was considered normal. I never heard of any judge at that time would say that they didn't trust that the defendants would commit the said offense during bail. Presumption of innocence was well observed. Reporters wouldn't feel any restriction on reporting anything in open trials, except for knowing the fact that we shouldn't disclose the facts for cases that would be committed to be tried at the High Court. Now everything has changed. Even reporting details about bail application is banned by the courts in Hong Kong. Judges rarely consider public interest when they make judgments. I appreciate that there have been some efforts to pressure the Hong Kong and Chinese governments. However, the situation won't change if the Hong Kong and Chinese governments can't see the real consequences. We shouldn't give them the impression of business as usual, as they are cracking down on our civil society. While various governments have issued statements expressing concern about the erosion of human rights in Hong Kong, it's difficult to see any real impact, as the Chinese and Hong Kong governments have realized that they can continue doing business despite severe criticism of human rights records. Authoritarian regimes like China and their supporters have learned that they can divert attention of all criticism on human rights by pointing out that there are also serious human rights violations in democratic countries. However, check and balance is what democracies should emphasize as different from tyrannies. Democratic governments should make the business community realize that there's real consequence for colluding with dictatorship. Combining the effort of pushing China and Hong Kong to comply with international human rights standards and economic sanctions on senior government officials would be the most effective and mutually beneficial way to ensure accountability. Otherwise, democracies will eventually succumb to authoritarian propaganda, which nobody would want to see. Therefore, I would urge the US government to impose further sanctions on all senior government officials in Hong Kong and China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poon. And your description of an individual coming to Hong Kong and saying, "I could finally breathe the air of freedom," is certainly a description of an event that can no longer take place in any shape or form. And really appreciate your testimony. And we are now going to turn to Ms. Wong. And Ms. Wong is joining us from the United Kingdom.
Dear Mr. Chair, Co-Chair, and other commissioners, thank you very much for holding this meeting. It really means a lot for us. I just get a little emotional when Mr. Chris Smith mentioned those names. They all are my dear friends. I miss them a lot. And I can't see them in Hong Kong anymore. I was born in China, and I spent my whole childhood there. It was in Hong Kong that I experienced awakening to the universal values of freedom, equality, social justice, and individual rights. I have spent almost my entire adult life in the civil society, and my main focus are fighting for ethnic equalities for ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, especially those from South Asian origin, like Nepalese, India, and Pakistani. And other is I joined the democracy movement, fight for universal suffrage in Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be the capital of protest for good reasons. First, the Hong Kong government was not democratic and not so responsive. After the handover, the formulation of government policies were very bad. And we learned that only when issues were taken to the street that officials might respond. And second, because there were independent media, and they did a very good job that they helped to putting pressure on the government and draw public attention and concerns. And the third reason is Hong Kongers now have very high awareness of their freedom of assembly and speech. So we used protests, marches, petition to defend our individual rights. And the last reason was there was a huge gap between rights promised and rights delivered. The Basic Law Act, Article 39, provides for human rights protections as guaranteed by Hong Kong Bill of Rights. For example, it's the ICCPR and the ICQA. And also we do have 4 pieces of equal opportunities laws, namely Disability Discrimination Ordinance, Race Discrimination Ordinance, and Sex Discrimination Ordinance, and Family Status Discrimination Ordinance. However, the national security law has taken away all these rights. I will say the civil societies in Hong Kong is dead. Now, no more. When I first read the national security law, I was very naive. I thought that the crimes of secession, sedition, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces should be of no concern to my work, that fighting for equality for minorities. But then I noticed that the national security law instructs the Hong Kong government to strengthen propaganda, guidance, supervision, and administration over schools, social groups, media, and the internet. Soon, I realized that the national security law means a total crackdown on the civil society. In Hong Kong, many non-governmental organizations, we call NGO, that provide social service for the people who are in need. They receive almost 100% receive funding from the government. So after the handover, and also our amendment on the funding mode, that means every 3 years, an NGO needs to review sign the contract with the government, and then create very serious self-censorship. Now, no more social service agency with criticizing government policies. So therefore, there we have another sector that if you want to criticize or challenge those injustice policies or unfair policies, injustice systems, that we will go to the civil societies, or we set up our own civil societies. So I must let you know that in Hong Kong, civil societies is entirely separate and different from NGOs in Hong Kong. For the social services, now completely silenced. And just recently, we have an amendment that on our professional social workers ordinance, that anyone who violates the national security law will be deregistered, and with their license will be taken away forever. And then the Labor Bureau is organizing study groups on the speech that Xi Jinping given in the 25th of anniversary of the handover. And this is very important, that the Labor Bureau or the government officials, they will count on who are present and who are absent. What does it mean? That if you are present, you are loyal enough, it's easy for you to get the government funding. Now, there is only those NGOs that to be seen as patriotic that you can get fundings. If those NGOs, you don't really cooperate with the government policy or join the study groups, I'm afraid it's very difficult for them to survive. This is the case in the social work profession and also the NGOs in Hong Kong. But I would like to talk about is the civil society. I first joined the Civil Human Rights Fund back to 2002. That when it set up, I joined it when I was advocating for the legislation against racial discrimination. And I really rely on the civil societies, the joint effort to pressurize the government. For example, because that was very poor education policy for ethnic minorities, especially those from the working class. And then I need to cooperate with the professional teachers union. And now you know that it was shut down, no more. And then when all the Pakistani, Nepalese, India, the working class, they do not enjoy the equal wages. They were discriminated in the working places. And then we need trade unions. And then I always went to Lê Trợt Yang, CTU, Confederation of Trade Unions. But now it's shut down and Lê Trợt Yang is in jail. And then I need to rely on some different civil societies through Civil Human Rights Fund. Now it is also gone, no more. And then another issue is, before I used to join the civil societies delegations to lobby to the UN because Hong Kong has signed a lot of human rights conventions and covenants. And we did not really worry or afraid of being prosecuted. But now, this time, just last week, when the hearing on the CCPR, on the China report, you see the committee members need to ask the Hong Kong official delegations that whether they can guarantee no Hong Kong civil societies will be prosecuted when they return to Hong Kong. And it's very different story now. And then we cannot go. And if I try to criticize any government policies through the media, of course now I doubt any media will report on it. But if there is it, I might be accused of inciting hatred toward the government. And then it's also violating the national security law. And then I just want to tell you that for the civil societies in Hong Kong, it's very difficult to survive. We could only rely on the public donations during the mass rallies or crowdfundings, but now you can't do it because you will be accused of money laundering. And then we rely, if we try to go to local corporate or local private family foundations, you can't because no one will support you because it dare not to upset the government. And then if you receive any fundings from the overseas, that means you are collusion with foreign forces. And that, now we are stuck. We don't have any way out at all. So, Mr. Chair and dear commissioners, I would like you to continue to pay attention to Hong Kong's situation. And that maybe please join hand in hand with those democratic countries that to defend human rights and democracy for the world, and put aside those very short-term interests that doing business with China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Wong, and appreciate your focus on many aspects of social services and also on the role of the media. And speaking of the role of the media, that's a good transition to our next panelist, Ching Cheong. Ching Cheong is joining us from Los Angeles. Chin,
The Chinese would draft the basic law. Beijing reminded the law drafters that post-1997 Hong Kong should only be an economic city and not a political one, which suggests that the thriving civil society might be curtailed. The Chinese Communist Party was worried that civil society organizations might be used as vehicles for the infiltration of Western influence to subvert this one-party dictatorship. In early 1990s, I gained access to a report by the National Security Ministry, in which it identified 5 social groups that might be potentially dangerous to the CCP. These include journalists, religious leaders, lawyers, educators, and social workers. In 2003, Beijing mapped out a detailed plan aimed at suppressing these 5 groups. It compiled a database of the prominent figures in each of these sectors and classified them according to their political attitude towards the CCP, either as friendly, neutral, or enemies, and developed different united front strategies for them, either to co-opt or eliminate them. It set up also a psychological warfare department to discredit those who were considered as not friendly. Beginning from 2003, the CCP took several important measures to abrogate the basic law commitments. All these measures were aimed at imposing the CCP's view on Hong Kong and gradually convert Hong Kong from a free society to an authoritarian one. Such efforts culminated in the enactment of the draconian national security law in 2020, which ultimately destroyed Hong Kong's civil society. Within the first year of its enactment, more than 60 civil society organizations were disbanded. Now I focus on the media sector. Before 1997, Hong Kong's media market was characterized by its plurality and diversity in their editorial lines. At those times, most of them were Taiwan-friendly. To reverse this situation, the CCP started a massive united front strategy, trying to convert the political stance of this newspaper. At that time, the number one man in Hong Kong, Mr. Georgetown, began to adopt a friendly approach by wining and dining newspaper owners and executives. The most successful cases being Singdao, Daily, and the Mingbao, which used to be against China taking back Hong Kong. Other means to transform the Hong Kong media include outright acquisitions of shares of major news outlets by pro-China business tycoons like the South China Morning Post, Mingbao, and the TVB. Such acquisitions resulted in obvious changes in their respective editorial policies. By 2014, the remaining mainstream news outlets that were still critical of the CCP and supportive of the democracy movement was Criminalize magazine and the Apple Daily, together with a few web-based media such as the Stand News and the Citizen News. The enactment of the national security law gave the authority wild sweeping power to shutter all the remaining pro-democracy news outlets, with Apple Daily and the Stand News bearing the full brunt. The chilling effect was obvious. The FCC voluntarily suspended its annual Human Rights Press Awards, citing the elusive red line of the national security law. The Hong Kong Journalists Association lowered the threshold for this solution in anticipation of the pressure to disband itself. The Independent Commentators Association, which I was instrumental in setting up, set up to safeguard media freedom, went into silent voluntary dissolution. To avoid the acts, the editorial policies of news outlets had to toe Beijing's line. The obvious examples is to call the Russian invasion of Ukraine as special military operation instead of invasion, and turn out commentaries that blame the US for precipitating the Russian invasion. Now, I want to turn to the lessons for the world. In a short span of 25 years, the once free society soon degenerated into an authoritarian one. For over a century, Hong Kong had served as the haven for the political dissidents from China. Now it became the exporters of political refugees itself. Once prized as the freest place in the Chinese-speaking world, now experienced unprecedented curtailment on freedom of speech and expression. The Pearl of the Orient, a highly successful crossbreed of East and West civilizations, began to lose its luster and irreparable loss to the whole world. Thus, Hong Kong provides a classic example of how, in time of peace, a free society based on the rule of law is being converted into an authoritarian one in which law itself becomes a tool of political repression. The world should learn from Hong Kong's tragic experience and draw important lessons therefrom to avoid begetting the same fate. What alarms me is that the tactics the CCP used to convert Hong Kong are being applied in Western democracies as well. These familiar tactics include propaganda, United Front strategy, party building mechanism, infiltration, and intelligence, to name the most obvious ones. All these tactics are clearly at work in the West now. Hence, the dreadful experience of Hong Kong provides a wake-up call for the whole world. Caring for Hong Kong is not just for Hong Kong's own sake, but for the sake of the whole world. Since we witnessed firsthand how the fundamental pillars of a free society can be easily destroyed by the CCP, we feel duty-bound in explicitly state the obvious danger. So I come to my policy recommendations. One for Hong Kong and one for the US. On Hong Kong, we hope Congress should pass the provision in Section 303, the Hong Kong Freedom and Choice provision, and other Hong Kong focused measures in HR 5421 as soon as possible. For the US, I hope the Congress could try to proactively step up the surveillance of CCP-related activities in the US. Under the framework of CECC, I think it should find out ways to combat or reverse the appeasement sentiment towards the CCP, which is, I find, quite rampant in the US. Thank you for giving me this chance to express my ideas.
Thank you, Mr. Ching. And our fourth witness is able to join us here from Washington, D.C., and we see how scattered our witnesses are. Hong Kong, Los Angeles, or not in Hong Kong, but in Japan, United Kingdom, Los Angeles. And it's we're glad to have Mr. Bickett here in person to share his story, his experience as a human rights lawyer, which bears so directly on the challenges faced in Hong Kong. Welcome, Mr. Bickett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to testify today. The Hong Kong justice system has been corrupted by Beijing's repressive security apparatus. If a case is of political interest to Beijing, a defendant has little hope of receiving a fair trial. Compared to the national security law, little is said about the deterioration of traditional common law courts. But the vast majority of political prisoners were charged under laws on the books for decades, which have been twisted to suit Beijing's current purposes. High-profile political defendants wrongly charged in these courts face an impossibly rigged system. Many ordinary judges have been willing participants in dismantling rule of law. The burden of proof has been turned on its head. Rather than requiring the prosecution to prove its case, judges often declare that defendants haven't sufficiently proved their innocence. And judges regularly ignore or even falsify exculpatory evidence to reach a guilty verdict. Judges who follow the law are punished. When Beijing attacked several judges who acquitted protesters in 2020, the judiciary's leadership removed them. State media harassed one judge so severely that in 2021, he abruptly resigned and moved with his family to the UK. Similar purges have taken place in the DOJ and police. The message to civil servants has been clear: get in line or suffer the consequences. Private lawyers are next. The Law Society and Bar Association recently launched investigations into dozens of lawyers for their work representing protesters. Many human rights lawyers have already been harassed out of town. One judge has even suggested lawyers offering services to protesters may be criminally liable as accomplices. While others have gone through much worse, including many that the representative spoke of earlier, my own experience illustrates how deeply corrupted the process has become. In December 2019, I came across two men at an MTR station in Hong Kong, beating and choking a teenager with a baton. As cell phones recorded the incident, the men denied that they were police officers. I grabbed the baton, stopped the attacks, and detained one of the men until the police came. But the police claimed then that the man, Yu Shu Sang, was actually a police officer. Yu admitted to the police that he had not only lied about being a police officer, but that he had also falsely accused the teenager of a crime he didn't commit. All of this was caught on video. Nonetheless, the police arrested me and let the attackers go free. At the police station, I underwent a common interrogation method in Hong Kong. They put me in a room with the temperature set at around 35 degrees Fahrenheit for hours at a time, periodically taking me out for interrogation before putting me back into the near-frozen room. I spent 2 days in custody before getting bail. The DOJ is required by law to act independently, but in political cases, it is the police calling the shots. The first prosecutor in my case told us that the police pressured her bosses to pursue the charges because I was a foreigner who had, quote, embarrassed the police on camera. She was soon replaced. After that, at every court hearing, 2 police officers sat behind the new prosecutor, Mimi Ng, and instructed her. This scene, police officers literally whispering into the ear of prosecutors, is now common in court in almost every political case. At my May 2021 trial, we showed exculpatory videos, and police officers openly admitted to lying repeatedly, destroying evidence, and witness tampering. Magistrate Arthur Lam simply disregarded all of this and outright invented a new set of facts, unconcerned about how this conduct would look to observers. This has also become very common. In these common law cases, non-NSL cases, we see it all the time, and it's not talked about enough. He then sentenced me to 4.5 months in prison. After nearly 2 months behind bars, I was released on bail so that I could appeal. The court assigned the case to a notorious national security judge, Esther To. Judge assignments are supposed to be random, but they no longer are. High-profile political cases almost always go to a small circle of the most virulently pro-Beijing judges. Again, I'm not talking about national security cases, which of course do. These are regular common law cases. Judge To, of course, upheld my conviction and sent me back to prison for the rest of my sentence. There's much that the US and its allies can do to increase the cost of Hong Kong's crackdown. I'm just going to address 3 of those proposed actions today, all of which would protect American interests as well. First, existing sanctions are nowhere close to sufficient as a deterrent. I urge Congress and the White House specifically to issue sanctions against mid-level prosecutors and police officers, casting the net wide and low enough to send a message to the civil service's rank and file. If they continue to infringe on defendants' rights, there will be consequences. Additionally, I urge Congress to finally provide a special immigration pathway for Hong Kongers to live and work in the United States and eventually obtain citizenship. Those now fleeing Hong Kong will make exceptional contributions wherever they land, and it is America's loss and, frankly, America's shame that the country is not doing more to attract them here. Passing the American Competes Act with the Hong Kong refugee provisions intact would be a good first step. Finally, many American companies continue to fund China's abuses through massive foreign investment. And law in the mold of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that prohibits U.S. persons from facilitating serious human rights abuses could be a game changer. Any such law must also permit private actions against offenders, allowing much of the enforcement effort to be undertaken by private plaintiffs and holding companies accountable for what they're doing in Hong Kong and China. I'm out of time, and I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bickett, for sharing your experience as a human rights lawyer, but also as just an individual who intervened to assist someone who was being beaten up and then saw the entire episode changed in kind of a Kafkaesque fashion into which you became the criminal rather than the savior, and not just suffered time in prison, but under a form of freezing air torture, if you will. And we appreciate that you're here now, able to share your experiences freely and to suggest ways that the U.S. can be more aggressive. We're going to turn to our periods of questioning now. It's 7 minutes, and I'll ask each person to try to constrain themselves to that time limit, and to our witnesses, try to be fairly crisp in your responses so we can get through as many questions as possible. And I'll start with Ms. Wong. And what you describe in Hong Kong bears close resemblance to what we know about mainland China. Officials tolerating some social welfare organizations as long as they strictly self-censor themselves, while treating those advocating for citizens' participation in governance much more harshly, leaving little space for human rights lawyers or independent journalists or women's or LGBTQ rights organizations or labor organizers or religious organizations, not to mention foreign NGOs. Is this how you see things, that the control of civil society in Hong Kong now closely resembles what we have seen in mainland China?
Yes. I would say, all the strategies, suppressing the NGOs in China now is happening in Hong Kong.
Thank you. So you're in exile, and how do Hong Kongers in exile preserve the spirit of Hong Kong and work to rebuild civil society abroad? Is it really possible to benefit those who are still in Hong Kong?
We live in exile, working very hard to keep our spirit and form different NGOs with different nature, different services. Is we really want to tell our friends that still in Hong Kong that we never forget them. We are working hard, no matter just international lobbying or just we're doing some concrete work to the Hong Kongers who are in need in other countries. So, and this is what we can do. Of course, we don't think that we can really affecting the current situations in Hong Kong, but we do hope, because of our lobbying, our advocacy, that international communities will help to resolve or improve the situation in Hong Kong.
Thank you. And Mr. Bickett, let me turn to you. I think it was often thought that China would restrain itself in regard to Hong Kong, in part because it had made this agreement when Hong Kong was turned over of two systems within one country, in part because of the implications for Taiwan, and in part because of the implications for the business community and the concern that they might destroy kind of the golden egg. And yet, the golden egg hasn't been destroyed by their actions. You do suggest in your testimony that the business community has been put in a situation where they had previously relied on transparency and independence of the legal system, but the legal system is completely corrupted now. How have we seen the reaction of the business community, and is the business community kind of proceeding forward, maintaining its presence in Hong Kong, more or less accommodating itself to the national security law?
I think we're seeing a number of different attitudes. Overall, I think I would say that the business community, especially the foreign business community, is not as concerned as they should be about what's happening in Hong Kong. I think a lot of businesses are somewhat deluding themselves that the breakdown of rule of law and of the court system will only apply to political individuals, locals, things like that. Obviously, my case raises questions about that, but there are other issues that have come up that I think suggest that that's simply not the case. And one only needs to look over the border into China to see why. Does any foreign company operating in China really think that if they have a dispute with, say, China Construction Bank, that they're going to have any chance of winning that dispute in China, no matter what the situation is? Does any company think that if they have intellectual property that they want to protect and have a legal right to protect in China, that they're going to be able to do so? No. I can't imagine any reason why that would be different in Hong Kong now that China has decided to do what it's doing to Hong Kong. Beyond that, I think companies are playing a little fast and loose with their own employees. Companies are telling their employees, don't worry, go over there, it's safe. You can be an expat in Hong Kong, you can live up on Victoria Peak and nobody will ever notice you. I think my case shows why that's simply not the case. And companies, really need to ask themselves, is it really worth it, the business that they're doing in Hong Kong and in China, to be putting their employees at risk, to be putting their business at risk? It's going to continue to clamp down on people, and there are going to be arbitrary arrests of Americans and of others for political reasons or otherwise.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bickett and Mr. Ching, in your testimony, you both call for the United States to provide special immigration pathways for Hong Kongers. This has been a major priority for members of this commission. What message does it send if we welcome to our shores those fleeing persecution? And what message does it send if we fail to welcome to our shores those who are fleeing persecution? And either of you feel free to jump in.
I can go first. Look, I think, all of us on this panel have a lot of friends in Hong Kong and a lot of people who are trying to leave. This is noticed, right? What's happening in the U.S. domestically or with foreign policy, it's noticed by those abroad. What happened in the 2020 election is noticed by those abroad. And what's happening with the United Kingdom, with Australia, with Canada, welcoming Hong Kong refugees with open arms, people notice it and people talk about it. When people talk about where they're going to go, they tell us that they don't feel welcome in the United States. And I think that, frankly, there's a lot of people in our leadership who don't want to welcome them. And I think that's really unfortunate. Hong Kongers are ideal immigrants who would come here and make an incredible contribution. And I really hope that the provisions, particularly in the America Competes Act, can be included in the final version of the bill that gets passed by Congress.
And Mr. Ching, did you wish to comment? And then I'll turn this over to my co-chair.
Agree with Samuel. I agree with Samuel. The American society has been regarded as the beacon of freedom and democracy. And yet when Hong Kong was in such a poor state, there is not sufficient support for a channel for people coming to the U.S. And I understand that those applying for political asylum has to wait for a long, long time. For example, in my case, I've been waiting for 2 years without getting an interview. So this kind of attitude is quite discouraging to those who try to seek refuge in the U.S., which was considered as the beacon of freedom by people around the world. So I think there should be better access for those who want to come to the U.S. to have this chance.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Co-Chair McGovern. When it comes back to my second round, I want to clarify what you pointed out there, that you've been applying for 2 years to be able to come to the United States, and that your application has not been granted. Thank you. Co-Chair McGovern.
Thank you. Each of you has testified in support of imposing additional sanctions on Hong Kong officials. In 2020, then Chief Executive Carrie Lam famously said that she keeps piles of cash at home because she has no bank account after U.S. sanctions landed on her. So 2 years later, have officials had time to adjust, or can you assess the effectiveness of further sanctions, both materially and symbolically? And I'll just ask everybody for a brief answer. Mr. Bickett, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah, so I think a couple of points on the sanctions issue. In my past life, I was a sanctions lawyer in the corporate context as well. Sanctions are a mixed bag. I have sort of some reluctance on sanctions and how they're used. In particular, if you look at something like the Carrie Lam sanctions, they're great in the sense that they send a message, they encourage Hong Kongers, and they make a difference. It's also hilarious, the image of her having cash in her house. I think it makes Hong Kongers very happy to know that. But it doesn't deter anyone. Individual sanctions against a leader doesn't deter anyone, and that's why in my testimony I focused on civil servants. Mm-hmm. If you start sanctioning a group of civil servants at a lower level, prosecutors who have prosecuted particularly egregious cases, police officers who have been responsible for torture or things like that at a mid-level, then people lower in the ranks start to realize, hey, this isn't just going to be Carrie Lam and her cash house. This is going to be, us potentially. Those are the people who, they're not going to go out and say, I quit and leave the service, but they're going to potentially quietly start restraining themselves a little bit. And there is an urgency to that. A lot of these cases are still going through the system. Once they've all gone through the system, there's going to be, little deterrent effect. It's all going to be done. So that's something that I would encourage the Congress to do very quickly. As for whether there's been time to adjust, that's absolutely true. We don't get the details, but I would assume that by this point, Carrie Lam and John Lee and these people who have been sanctioned have been able to get a bank account through a Chinese bank. And that's sort of the double-edged sword of sanctions. The more the United States uses them, the more our adversaries adjust and find ways to get around them and set up mechanisms to do so. With that said, Carrie Lam will never be able to travel to the United States. She probably, despite them not issue sanctions, won't be able to get a flight ticket to go to the UK or to Europe. These things matter. They matter to Carrie Lam, who, despite everything that she says, absolutely loves the West and doesn't want to spend the rest of her days in China. And they certainly would matter to civil servants who might have money, family, and just simple travel plans abroad.
Chong? I think you have to unmute.
I think the sanction has symbolic values, sending strong message to those who want to implement Beijing's draconian rule. And I think the sanction should go right to the top, not just the middle level officials. In my mind, I think Xi Jinping himself should be personally held accountable for all the atrocities he committed to Hong Kong. Right in 2008, he came to Hong Kong and said that the power systems in Hong Kong, the three powers, executive, judicial, and legislative, should cooperate with each other. He is the man who first violated the basic law commitment to Hong Kong. And I think if any sanction is going to be effective, it should be directed at the #1 man who brought about all these problems to Hong Kong. If you simply sanction Carrie Lam or John Lee, it won't be as effective. So if the American government is adamant at punishing the CCP, efforts should be directed, sanction efforts should be directed at Xi Jinping.
Thank you. Ms. Wong?
I agree that sanctions to individual officers, either #1 or Hong Kong top officials, we send a very important meaning, even though maybe they can just another way to have a ban of China, but still because as far as I know, the Hong Kong officials, they don't have any so-called mission or whatever. What they want is a personal interest. So if a sanction goes to personal, that will be more effective. At least we make them second thought about it. So we agree. Also with Mr. Ching. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Poon?
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of them. I think like for the sanctions, it will be targeted on the top and also the medium level that actually would send a very clear message to the the government officials that they would not be spared if they would be continuing their human rights violation. And then I think like for further sanction, that should be also linked with to influence other businesses also, because as I argued earlier, like we shouldn't make like the business also feel like they can do business as usual, and then also for some of the family members of like senior officials, like Carrie Lam's family are still like living overseas. Without any consequence.
Right.
I mean, like, I'm not talking about like they should be punished, but it's actually like when actually so many young protesters in Hong Kong, they're trying so hard to flee Hong Kong, but there's actually not enough ways for them to flee Hong Kong. But they can see that even like Carrie Lam's family can still really, live a good life in overseas. It's actually quite ironic. So I mean, if we want to have really something more useful, then it should be like a very, very strong sanction conditions, and shouldn't be just like restrict to a very few conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think I'm out of time, but I just want to, and I have unfortunately to go to another hearing, but I just want to, at some point, in further on as you're answering questions, one of the things that I think is important, would be important for us to hear is whether or not you think that our current administration here in Washington, or the Congress, whether or not there is an impression that we are taking matters in Hong Kong seriously enough, that whether or not we are responding in a way that is that people think we should. And I don't want to get other time, but my guess is that you don't. And so that's why these recommendations and this conversation is important, to figure out what we can do next and what we can do more, because what is happening in Hong Kong is unconscionable. And some of the people that the chairman and I mentioned, and Mr. Smith mentioned, these are people who we not only know, but they're our friends. They're good people who are in jail for no good reason, and it really is quite shocking and unconscionable. So I thank you all, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Co-Chairman Govern. And let's turn to Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for their very sobering testimony, which I think makes very clear that we are not doing enough. And that goes for the Congress, it goes for the president, it goes for other world leaders. And if you would like to comment further on that, we are living in a time when Xi Jinping is directly responsible for a genocide against the Uyghurs. and other people in that region of the world, in Xinjiang, when he continues to bitterly oppress the Tibetan people, when he commits gross violations of human rights across the entirety of China, with the prevalence and the pervasive use of such things as torture, the theft of people's organs simply because the Chinese Communist Party wants to make money. Well, Xi Jinping is directly responsible for all of that and the ongoing oppression of the people of Hong Kong. And I'm just wondering why you think we are not doing more. Is it empathy fatigue? Is it that people in the West are, while they're originally outraged over certain behaviors, begin to accommodate and then actually enable, however unwittingly? But I don't think we do enough. And I would appreciate your thoughts on that. When Ms. Wong, you said that civil society is dead, that is horrible. That is heartbreaking, because these are the people, as you pointed out, your friends and our friends too, but your friends in a very, very personal level. So please know how much all of us feel for you and for your fellow Hong Kongers who have fought so hard and see nothing but Xi Jinping's oppression in the future, unless the world rallies in a very significant way. I mean, the sanctions we've done have been slap on the wrist. That's all it is. It's not much more, and it needs to significantly expand. And I would appreciate any thoughts all of you might have on that. I would, Mr. Bickett, if you wouldn't mind, thank you for your testimony. Which U.S. companies do continue to enable? Again, I have found, I'm one of those who, going back to when MFN was delinked from human rights on May 26, 1994, by President Clinton. In my humble opinion, that's when we largely lost China with that delinkage. And sadly, we have been able to get it back. But it seems to me that the companies are the glue that helps this dictatorship, stay wedded to profits and power. And maybe you might want to speak again to specific companies and industries that are acting in a way that is totally self-interested and not interested in the people of Hong Kong. Let me also, if you would, in your answers, the social credit system, which is applied throughout China. Obviously, many of the businesses are both on the mainland China and in Hong Kong. While it would appear it's not directly imposed upon Hong Kongers, this idea of surveilling every Chinese citizen and business with the use of data to monitor, shape, and rate financial, social, religious, or political behaviors is the worst manifestation of the surveillance state the world has ever known. And I'm wondering how that applies currently in Hong Kong, especially with this escalating influence, almost total dominance by Xi Jinping on China. And finally, if I could, on the issue of, May of last year, the State Administration of Religious Affairs, or SARA, issued new regulations entitled the Administrative Measures for Religious Clergy, and it forces all clergy to pledge allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. Article 3 of the regulation states, and I quote, religious clergy should love the motherland, support the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, support the socialist system, and adhere to the direction of synodization of religion in China. This is an invasive usurpation of religious freedom, as we have already seen its deadly effects in places like Tibet and elsewhere. And I'm wondering, is any of this being applied, and to what extent, in Hong Kong? The basic law obviously was supposed to convey fundamental religious freedom. How does this, synodization means simply all religions must comport to the principles of Xi Jinping and Chinese Communist ideology. So if you could speak to that, I would appreciate it as well. I yield to our witnesses, beginning with Mr. Bickett, if you could.
Sure, I'll try to go through those, maybe not in that order. So starting with the last one, there is obviously, the most notable, as you mentioned earlier, clampdown on religion is in the arrest of Cardinal Zen, who was really just doing his duty as a religious figure and was arrested for that. What I think may have gotten not seen as closely in the news with that is that the Vatican actually just threw him under the bus. I think it was the Secretary of State in the Vatican, the cardinal there, outright said to the media, well, we just hope that this doesn't affect our upcoming renewal of an agreement with China to allow cardinals in the country. You know, I'm not a Catholic, but that's certainly not the Christ I know and the Christianity that I practice. And I just can't imagine them throwing a cardinal under the bus for that. So let me go back to the one that was specifically asked to me, which is about particular businesses. There are a lot. I think what I'll highlight is the financial industry. Banks are a little bit more subject to public pressure in the sense that a lot of them have, you know, public accounts in the U.S. and things like that. Private equity and funds are, I think, the biggest offenders here. There's a great report that came out from Hong Kong Watch a couple of weeks ago that specifically addressed these issues with respect to BlackRock, Blackstone, some of these major investors into China. Another one that I'll point out here is in venture capital, Sequoia Capital, which the head of their China business is a high-ranking official in China, and their investments show it. These guys, some of these private equity and venture capital firms, they'll release happy press releases talking about their new investment into Chinese surveillance companies and how it's helped that company grow. These are American companies. And I think, you know, I don't know for sure, but I think a big difference with these companies versus, say, just a typical, you know, the Gap, is that the Gap worries about boycotts in the United States from regular people. The Gap worries about how their image will look across the world. Blackstone, KKR, so far less, simply because I think they're very complex firms that most people don't understand what they're doing, and they simply don't get that much blowback for it, and I think that needs to change. And I'll leave the other questions and to other people. I know that we're running over time.
Ms. Wong?
So I have no knowledge about the business sector. So yes, sorry.
Are world leaders, including President Biden, doing enough in raising the issue of Hong Kong and looking to do perhaps, which I think are needed, additional sanctions, especially against Xi Jinping?
I think no, not at all. So sorry to say that, because I hope that the U.S. should really defend for democracy, because now I think it's so important, human rights and democracy against, you know, authoritarianism. So I think should have a concrete action. It's not just say, you know, empty promise. I mean, concrete action really to defend the democracy for over the world. And then now Hong Kong is a good case that, you know, whether you have a really political will and decision to defend democracy, what I want to say.
Thank you.
If I can just,
Sure.
if I can just pile on sanctions, just I think, as I've said, I think sanctions are important. Xi Jinping or anything else. Xi Jinping is not personally going to be affected by American sanctions. Let's be clear about that. It's symbolic, and it would be nice.
What about? And I agree with you to a large extent. But what about if he were to be singled out? I mean, you talk about committing genocide in plain view, and of course, the oppression of the people of Hong Kong is an egregious human rights abuse. Where are the International Criminal Court and like-minded bodies? I mean, they're never held accountable. And, you know, with people like Charles Taylor and Slobodan Milosevic, we wait until they're out of power or, you know, the world community finally wakes up long after the bloodletting and the abuse is finished. This is in real time as we meet. I mean, it's worth an effort, I would think, to hold him liable before a...
And Congressman, After the response to this question, we're going to be turning to Senator Ossoff.
On the International Criminal Court, I think everyone in this hearing would probably agree that it has very, very limited powers, and in particular, it has no enforcement mechanism. Where you see ICC or international prosecutions, it's because the governments have turned the people over. With that said, I agree with you that there's something to be said for, if not Xi Jinping, investigations into, in particular, the genocide in Xinjiang, the activities in Hong Kong, et cetera, and Tibet as well. But I think the point I always try to emphasize on sanctions is that I worry in the U.S. Congress and in the presidency that sanctions often are used as an easy way to say we're doing something, and then issue a few sanctions on individuals who it might affect a little without changing any policy abroad, and then packing up and going home. And that's in particularly why I focused in my introduction on something like a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act like law that would actually target American companies behaving badly, because that's what we have the most influence over. Yes, sanctions, issue them, but it can't be all that we do. It simply, at the end of the day, does not do enough by any stretch to further American policy abroad.
Thank you. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask consent to enter into the record the names of 13 journalists or defenders of press freedom who are currently under arrest, in detention, or incarcerated in Hong Kong.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you know, prior to my election to the Senate, I worked in the production of investigative journalism, investigating war crimes, official corruption, human rights abuses. Mr. Ching, I'd like to ask you for a detailed update on how, since the imposition of the national security law on Hong Kong, the CCP's efforts to dismantle press freedom and freedom of expression are continuing.
Okay. First of all, the chilling effect of the closing down of Apple Daily is very, very alarming. The FCC, for example, have run this Human Rights Press Award for over 26 or 25 years, and yet all of a sudden, after going through all this process of selecting the awards, FCC suddenly announced that they were going to suspend it. So, citing the national security law, which imposed a elusive red line. Now, this is a very big blow to the press freedom in Hong Kong, because FCC has been promoting itself as one of these vanguards of press freedom, and yet it succumbed to the pressure of the national security law. Following the action of FCC, a number of other press organizations also chose to shut down. For example, the Hong Kong Journalists Association, the other day it passed a resolution to lower the threshold for dissolution. Why? Because it anticipated pressure from the authority to close it down, and instead of being forced to close down, they choose to try to dissolve itself voluntarily. Although they have a very high bar for this self-dissolution, and then they convene a AGM to lower the bar, lower the threshold for self-dissolution. And unfortunately, the one that I have found, the Independent Commentators Association chose to wind down silently, voluntarily. So the chilling effect is so strong that I think it will have a deep impact on journalism in Hong Kong. And you know, the Keith Richard Bird, the president of SCC, he's also teaching at the JMSC in Hong Kong U, which is a very renowned education outlet for journalism. He told his students to be careful and to be smart in avoiding a red line. So if this kind of mentality is taught, passed on to future generations of journalists, then I don't think Hong Kong would be able to maintain a press freedom environment anymore. So I think the chilling effect of the shutdown, the way Apple Daily and the Stand News was shut down was quite serious in intimidating the entire profession.
Thank you, Mr. Ching. And with my remaining time, can you comment if you have any knowledge or experience of how the CCP is seeking to influence or intimidate or coerce or shape reporting, publication, and journalism pertaining to Hong Kong, even by reporters, writers, and publications who are beyond Hong Kong's borders or beyond the PRC's borders? How do they engage in such efforts internationally?
Well, the most common tactics is this united front strategy. They'll try to get close to you, even if you are far away from the Chinese judicial territory. They'll try to get someone close to you, try to persuade you that China is not that bad. Maybe you are guided by misinformation from the West and things like that. And they try to befriend you and try to get your trust. And then by and by, they will tell you what you should report and what you should avoid. For journalists outside of China, right now they don't have this long arm yet, but they will try to have colleagues conducting this kind of united front strategy on you.
Thank you, Mr. Ching. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff. And I want to go back to you, Mr. Ching. You're operating now from Los Angeles, but you mentioned that you've been applying for some form of immigration status for a couple of years without it coming through. Can you expand on that story a bit to give us any insights?
Well, yeah, I came to the U.S. For a conference, but because of the COVID-19, all the flights back to Hong Kong were suspended, and I have to wait for reassignment of seats until finally the national security law comes in. And I, looking at the law itself, I understand that I have no hope of returning home safely. So I applied for political asylum in the States, and that was 2 years ago. And until now, I don't get even a chance to interview. So I wonder if it because of this some senators point out that the U.S. might not be very receptive to political refugees from Hong Kong. Maybe this is the reason, and I hope, therefore, that you should map out a way to expedite political refugees who want to come to the U.S.
So even in a situation where you have an extraordinary risk should you return to Hong Kong because of your commentaries and your writings, the asylum process has just essentially been frozen.
Sorry?
the asylum process for you, for consideration of your application for asylum, has essentially been dysfunctional or frozen.
I don't know. I don't know what happens.
Okay. Well, thank you. I do think that the fact that our door has not been opened to champions of human rights and free speech and free assembly who are being oppressed through the national security law in China is of great concern to me. I did want to turn to you, Mr. Bickett. You had the experience of being detained and subjected to extensive, I guess, being trapped in a room at 35 degrees. And from your knowledge of the prisons in Hong Kong, is this the only technique? What other techniques are used to make people suffer, if you will? And I've heard references that the biggest fear is being deported to China, and if that is correct, could you expand a little bit on the concern there? That is deported to mainland China from Hong Kong.
Sure, and if I can just add on your previous question on asylum, one of the big reasons why, so most of the activists that you sometimes see roaming these halls trying to bug senators about things in particular, and many of the Hong Kong activists are applying for asylum right now. One of the big reasons why it's just a wholly inadequate solution for Hong Kong and Chinese immigrants is that once you file that application, all of these people are effectively cut off from their lives in Hong Kong. If you apply for asylum, it puts you on, I mean, it certainly puts you on a political list. It puts your families on political lists. They can't really communicate with their families anymore to keep them safe. Whereas if there was just a normal mechanism for them to come to this country, it would be less likely to draw that attention. They're also heavily restricted from traveling, so that's a particular issue for many of the activists who need to go to conferences, who need to go try to raise awareness about China and Hong Kong. There is a process where they can apply to customs and immigration for leave to travel abroad, but it's usually either denied or delayed greatly. So it's just really an inadequate solution for people. On your other question about treatment in custody. When I was put in the freezing room, this is a very common thing that the police do, not the prisons necessarily, but the police when you're in custody. There was somebody who died from it a few months ago when it really came out how many people were going through this. And I think it's a way for them to not leave marks on people, but do enhanced interrogation or torture or whatever you want to call it. It's pretty widespread. There are beatings that people have reported and violence from police. You don't hear that in as much of a widespread way as you do the freezing room and other things that don't leave a mark. In the prisons themselves, most correctional services officers are relatively mild, particularly at the junior levels. My impression is that I should qualify this with the fact that me, because of who I was, because of my high profile, and because of my foreign passport, I was clearly kept away from certain things. You did see police, or you did see prison officials beating people sometimes. You saw them punishing people in ways they shouldn't have. It was rarely related to politics. It was more related to this person is annoying me. Where we see more systematic abuse of prisoners, high-profile political prisoners in the prison system is directed by senior officials. In particular, you have someone like Jimmy Lai, who's been talked about a lot today from Apple Daily, who is kept isolated from the entire prison population, supposedly for his own protection, but really as a way to make him suffer. He is supposed to be allowed out for an hour a day for exercise. That may happen or it may not, but otherwise he's just sitting in a room. and isn't allowed to really interact. That is, no interaction with people. That's truly torture, and I can't imagine. He's not the only one. That happens to a lot of other high-profile political prisoners. They use a mechanism in their own regulations that supposedly allows them to remove people for protection reasons, and then they just extend it for years.
And can you address the fear folks have of being deported to China and possibly being cut off from all contact with individuals?
Yeah, I think that this is a fear for some of the high-profile people. People thought it was going to happen to Jimmy Lai for quite some time. There were some leaks coming out of the judiciary. So Jimmy Lai's case went up to the Court of Final Appeal, which is effectively the Supreme Court. And it was the first test of how the CFA was going to deal with the national security law, and they ruled against Jimmy Lai and basically ruled that he should be held indefinitely without trial before trial. There were leaks that came out that effectively this may have been because the court realized if they didn't do that, that Jimmy Lai and all of these others would be sent to China. And I don't say that to defend this court, which has been, absolutely cowardly in how it's dealt with these issues. But it shows that, in most aspects of society, there is always that present threat. And the simple threat of being sent to China makes prisoners act differently, makes civil society act differently, and Fermi can talk to that as well. And is a huge fear for Hong Kongers.
Thank you. I want to turn to Mr. Poon and Ms. Wong. And one of the threats I often hear about is the concern about retaliation against family members who are still in Hong Kong or in China. And can either of you shed any light on this risk? And have you had any experiences in which your own extended family, friends, associates in Hong Kong or China have been pressured in various ways because of your courage to speak out?
What I have been hearing, from many of my friends who living in the UK, I was in the UK in the past year before coming to Japan, then actually many people who used to work in, or still working in the NGO sector, they don't really want to talk. And that's why, I am not among those who always been talking publicly. But now I even feel that I would need to talk about all the situation publicly, because all the more famous ones, actually, they feel a lot of pressure, and they really feeling that they would be facing a lot of threats and danger. So I think because of the atmosphere, so even people would feel that they would not want to take the risk. And then also see the examples of Ted Hui, for instance, that you already see the kind of pressure, and also his bank accounts being frozen, etc. And also he's still being charged, even though he's already outside of Hong Kong. So from his example, it's actually also make others feeling very, very threatened. They don't want to talk even in public, even though those who used to be very famous and also be very outspoken when they were in Hong Kong. So I can feel the immediate, threats they feel, and then also the worries among them.
And Ms. Wong?
For myself, yes, I've been struggled, so you can feel that I dare not to call for sanctions to particular persons, because of my family all still in Hong Kong. Even though I prepare if anything happened to me, I'm prepared to cut the relationship with my family. But I know that maybe it cannot help. Another is about the NGO I found that I have a board of directors. I worry that why I did not mention because they're still serving different minorities, because my society is the only one, the first one and only one we do the advocacy for every minorities. So for example, yes, I'm fear. In fact, even though, some of my friends, asked me to attend the UN hearing just as before, because I worry about it will have do harm to my board of directors in Hong Kong and my family, so I did not go. And yes, but I really think that, there should be someone that have to speak, what has been happening in Hong Kong and really call for international community, for example, ESA, the US really, to do something. Yeah. So, yeah, that's why.
Well, thank you all. I keep having more questions come to mind based on your all's testimony and the situation, and but we're at the end of time, and there's a vote underway that will be closing, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. But it's not the end of the dialogue, because the Commission is working every single day with an extraordinary team to shed a light on these issues in Hong Kong and in China, and China's oppression of the rights of people in so many different ways. I really appreciate Mr. Poon, Ms. Wong, Mr. Ching, Mr. Bickett, your courage, your testimony, your outspoken and continuing work on behalf of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion and democratic processes, so that there is government by and for the people. And we have seen that extinguished in an extraordinarily dramatic fashion in Hong Kong in an incredibly short period of time, in complete violation of the commitments that China has made. We need to find every conceivable way to respond and to resist, and I appreciate the recommendations that you've put forward at this hearing. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, July 15th, for any items members would like to submit for the record, or for any additional questions for our witnesses. And again, thank you to every champion for human rights, for democracy, for opportunity, and for freedom. This hearing is adjourned.